Okay, this one's for Gabby.
I think that it was a different time than now. I think that there was a lot of national pride, and we went into Vietnam after the French had failed miserably there, thinking that we could go in there and fight a limited war on their ground. And unfortunately, you can't fight a war that you don't intend to win successfully. So all we did was send lots of young men to their deaths. An example of that is we bombed their ammunitions routes where they carried or transported the ammunition to and from the munitions factories, and we knew where the munitions factories were, but we never bombed the munitions factories. So it was a very limited war. Well, initially I think people were pretty optimistic about it, and there was a lot of national pride and, going in there where the French had failed, and we were going to go and it was going to be very limited. But what happened is, or a limited time, but what happened is because they didn't do it wholeheartedly, they didn't win. And it's very, very difficult to win a war on someone else's land, especially if you don't use all of your resources, which we did not use. And then when Lyndon Johnson became president, he decided he was going to be the person who made the decisions about how the war was fought, and he was he didn't have the capacity to do that. Well, at the beginning I was in favor. Towards the middle of the war and the end of the war, I was not in favor of it. However, I think that the way that we withdrew was totally inappropriate. It was a bloodbath for those people who had supported us in Vietnam, and we, I think, destroyed our reputation horribly by just abandoning ship and not making any provision for the people in Vietnam who had supported us during the war. And there were thousands of them that were just murdered. Well, it became popular to be anti-war. It's kind of like it is now. There's a lot of people that are popular. It's popular to be, in Oregon anyway, to be opposed to the war in Iraq and what's going on in Afghanistan. And people didn't look at the principles behind it. It was just sort of like a happening. And people were burning flags and all of those kinds of things that were very anti-American without really looking at the principles. It was more, the thing that was really important was how we were orchestrating the war, and not even the reason behind the war.
Well,
People went to be there as much as anything. It was really what was called in those days a happening. It was like we used to have these things called hootenannies where people would get together and sing, and it was the same sort of thing. It was a young social action, and a lot of it was ill-informed. My opinion about that is totally different today than it was then. Accurate reporting of what was happening. I think our newspapers failed us miserably. We didn't have good information like the internet, or access to information like we do now on the internet. And it was just, people were angry at the war because they were angry at the politicians. And it was and especially when you have friends that are dying over there and you don't see any end to it. And Lyndon Johnson?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eisenhower actually was a war hero. He was a general that was very successful in World War II, and he was very popular amongst the people. And Lyndon Johnson sort of came into office by default because of the assassination of Kennedy.
Yeah.
So he was an odd man. I mean, he was very egocentric. He was crude, and the media actually tried to cover a lot of that stuff up. A lot's come out since. But he was really underskilled for the position that he had. He got it by default.
What do you think were some of the mistakes that they had made?
Well, I think by not using the full force of our military. It was considered a police action, and we never really declared war. And we fought it as though it was a police action. We paid no attention to the miles and miles and miles of tunnels that they had. We just, and plus we had a drug problem over there with our military personnel were so frustrated and fearful by the way that it was being waged that, there was a lot of psychological escape that happened, and they did that through drugs. And but there were some phenomenal heroics that happened as well. I had a good friend actually two good friends that were killed over there, and it didn't have to happen the way it did. They just weren't given the kind of support they needed. The
Was
60s,
it?
it was huge here. It was a serious problem. I mean, anything was available anywhere. And unfortunately, our drug education system at that point was based totally on fear tactics. So nobody believed anything that was told to them, and it wasn't based on knowledge. You know, it was just amazing. That stories that, you know, it was like you would grow hair in the palms of your hands if you smoked marijuana. I mean, it was very strange, and it was, you know, people weren't so stupid that they believed it. Most people felt that it was unfair. In fact, it was stopped after the war. But most people thought it was unfair because they didn't believe in the war. It was in the World War II, people were, you know, falling all over themselves to sign up for the war because it was a great war. It was a moral war that we believed in, and we were going to someone else's aid. In this particular one, we were trying to keep something from happening. We were trying to keep communism from spreading. At least that's what they told us. But there was such huge corruption within that government that, you know, people just weren't in favor of it. And everybody that was either trying to avoid the draft as a conscientious objector, or going to Canada, or doing anything they could, you know, joining churches that were, you know, the Quaker Church. I was absolutely sympathetic. I think they were in a place that they shouldn't have had to be, and they were treated horribly when they came back. Our nation has a great shame in the way they treated those returning veterans, as far as I'm concerned. They would come back and people would spit on them. I mean, it was a terrible thing. They couldn't find jobs. There were, you know, all kinds of injuries. It was a horrible thing. The most influencing of the war protests. Well, for me, my brother went to Portland State and made a film on it, and set the video that he had taken of the protests and the marches that were anti-war to the song "The Universal Soldier." And for me, that my brother took that position. He actually got kicked out of school for doing that. That he felt so strongly. But at that point, my position on the war began to change because I became more informed.
What was your job at the time?
I was in school.
How did the war affect your schooling?
Well, it didn't affect mine because I'm a girl, and girls weren't subject to the draft. But guys were going to graduate school or going into medical school or doing anything they could to extend, or getting married, anything they could to avoid the draft. Well, it did, because my parents were very pro-government, and my brother and I were probably not as pro-government, so there was some stress in our home. And it took me a while to really realize, to try to figure out what I really believed in. You know, now I think that, you know, I really blame an ineffectual operation or running of the war to the loss of our national pride and losing so many young men that didn't need to be lost. Needed to get out regardless. And that's probably the reason that we pulled out in the way we did. You know, Vietnam, the capital, Hanoi, was completely overrun, and thousands of people were trying to get on the planes, climbing over fences, trying to get away from the Viet Cong as they came through, and, you know, people were filming them being slaughtered. You know, and all they had done was try to support the Americans. I mean, we really have a national shame about the way we exited that. But there were a lot of people. Bill and Hillary Clinton, for one, were two of the people that were very vocal in saying we had to get out now, and there was, you know, they knew so much about it that there was absolutely no chance that there would be a slaughter, that, you know, that was just the warmongers that said that we needed to take longer and withdraw in a specific way, and they were absolutely wrong. In fact, there was a fellow named Michael Medved who took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, who had been a very left-wing protester, saying, you know, we need to have a plan of withdrawal, not just an exodus. And went to both Bill and Hillary and asked them to sign that, and they wouldn't do that. But there were many young people in those days that did. He's actually now a talk show host in Seattle. Well, I would have done it in a way that provided a way for the people that had supported us to get to this country, if that's what we were going to do. I don't think I would have withdrawn when we did. I think what I would have changed is that if we really believed that we were stopping communism there, I would have made it not a limited engagement.